Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. My name is Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Group, and we are happy you're here spending some time with us. You know, in our last few episodes, we've tackled some pretty big questions like what the NEPA rulemaking might mean. We've looked at this year what we might expect in 2022 in terms of environmental and natural resources law and policy. Well, one of the things that I'm excited about our episode today is that we are going to be getting a little bit more specific. We're going to be talking about specific projects, concerns for each one of those projects. And the topic today relates to the development of renewable energy resources on properties that may have some historical environmental liabilities. And I'm joined today by two special guests. The first is Jason Hutt. He's a partner in our DC office. And we are joined today as well by Mike Borkowski, the president of the Community Power Group. Mike's here to help us understand some of the challenges in designing, building, and protecting renewable power projects that are located, that are sited and developed on contaminated properties. Welcome, Jason. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Daniel. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jason and Daniel, for inviting me on this podcast. Really excited for it.
So, Mike, before we dive into the topic, I would love to hear more about Community Power Group, what it does, and sort of your role and your vision for the company.
Yeah. I started a company called EPG, actually, back in 2010, EPG Solar. We've since converted the name to Community Power Group as things have changed over time. But the founding thesis of that company was that solar was just becoming financially viable at the time. Obama had stepped into the administration for a couple of years, and there was both Republican and Democratic support for renewable energy projects. And so all that coming together were leading to projects that were actually starting to compete with fossil fuels. And so we saw an opportunity to step into the industry and keep our focus on projects that would be financially viable in areas of land that people were open and accepting of solar energy. Because one of the things we initially saw was that while solar was starting to become financially viable, the public just wasn't ready yet to see it on different fields or different farms or in other places. And so in thinking through that, we were like, well, hey, where can we put these things that would be, win for everybody? And the first natural place to go to was landfills, brownfields, or other different types of fields that just didn't have a use, rooftops. And so I live in Maryland and was a frequent skier up at Liberty and Whitetail, which are small mountains, I don't know if you'd call them mountains, but rolling hills outside of DC that have some snow on them during times of the year. And we went past the Hagerstown landfills up there. They have a ton of landfills. And we're like, well, let's see about putting solar up there. And it was one of our first projects. We helped that county become one of the first counties in America where they got virtually almost all their energy from a green source. And we put the solar on their landfills up there, and it was great. The community at first, didn't even realize this was a possibility. And that's what we find over and over again, that the owners of these brownfields and landfills just don't know, hey, this is something I can actually do. I can turn this liability into a profit center. And that just got us excited. And so we really launched with that and then moved out into Massachusetts. We're in Ohio. We're working with Dominion Energy in Virginia. We do it out in Illinois, Colorado, and some other places, New York as well. And our goal is to provide cheaper energy that can be found on the grid on land that isn't really usable for other things. And so since then, we've migrated a little bit. And we have some other things. We do a lot of community solar. We dedicate community solar projects to disadvantaged communities. And more recently, with a lot of the changes, we've started working with corporates too, and how do they become green in a profitable way. So kind of taking that same thought process to the corporates.
So, Mike, you used this term brownfields, and that's an important term. Jason, I was thinking that we'd have you take a crack at defining it before we talk about some of the challenges to developing solar or really other kinds of renewable projects that, as Mike explained, turn these liabilities into profit centers. I think that's a great way of thinking about them. So, what do we mean when we say brownfields? What are we talking about?
What do we mean when we say? I think it means a lot of different things to different people, but let's start from, so environmental law holds owners and operators of properties responsible for any release of hazardous substance that requires remediation. And the scheme that began under a statute called CERCLA established a strict liability concept, which was very important to facilitating the cleanup of contaminated sites. Not just strict liability, meaning it didn't matter whether that release was caused in compliance with environmental law. It simply mattered whether there was a release. And then the parties that fell into that net of responsibility is everyone in that chain of title, both as owner and operator. So it's a joint and several liability scheme, meaning that not only is it joint and several liability, but if there's an orphan share, if one of those parties can't stand up for their portion of the responsibility, that orphan share is distributed to the remaining viable parties. And if there are still unpaid costs for some of those parties, you can tap into this thing called the super fund in certain circumstances if it's a listed site. So that was a very powerful statute, and it's done a lot to help the United States clean up significant contamination. But then the question was, how do you encourage investment in those properties from people who have had nothing to do with the underlying contamination?
So Mike is skiing down his Maryland hills / mountains. He's looking at the Hagerton landfill and sees it as a possible opportunity. Let's say Mike goes out and buys the Hagerton landfill or wants to operate on that site. As you've sort of explained, it's a potential exposure for him if there's some kind of release from that landfill, right? Is that kind of a decent summary?
Under the original construct of the Superfund statute and CERCLA, yes. If Mike called me and said, "Hey, Jason, I'm thinking about buying this landfill because we could put a solar project on it," I would have waved the orange flag and said, well, how are we going to protect ourselves from the liabilities associated with its historical use? The good news is that federal, state, and even some local laws have put in place some mechanisms to try to sort of walk back that liability scheme when the person coming to the property is seeking to redevelop it for a positive purpose, but not trying to step into the residual responsibility associated with how it was used before. So I think if Mike calls me today, or even in the last decade, there's been this evolving effort to try to encourage development on brownfields. In particular, there are statutes in place to encourage the use of brownfields for renewable energy projects.
I mean, Jason, I think that's an incredibly interesting point. And every time I talk to you, I always learn a little bit more about some of the legal nuances about, the potential of, acquiring these lands, just not leasing them, and how that liability can shift around. Because one of the things we see when we are developing these sites all the time is the landowners don't realize that by putting solar on these landfills or the brownfields, that risk profile doesn't change, right? Within the contract itself, we include all sorts of provisions that, yes, okay, we can continue to test the water, we can continue to test the soil. We're not going to do, if it's a landfill, anything that's going to penetrate the cap. We're going to have appropriate water management plans in place so that, however we put the panels on the field, is it going to cause erosion that disrupts or distributes any chemicals or waste material? And it's like one of the easiest sells as a company we can do is we call the brownfield owners up, and for them, it's almost too hard to believe, because they're sitting there in large part with this liability. And they're like, wait a second, I can turn this liability into something that's going to make money for me. And it's really expensive sometimes to maintain and carry these brownfields. And so, what I wish that they would do is, as a part of the post-closure permits or the annual maintenance plans, that they would put something in place that says, we also want you to do a renewable energy evaluation of a project on this site. Because if we did that, there'd be so many people out there that came in and realized, wait a second, I can actually do this. I think that would be a real way to push the industry forward quickly.
And I think one thing that's important about what Mike's saying is it's not just landfills. Landfills are in some ways some of the simplest examples because they go through this post-closure process, and there's often a cap on which you can place a solar array. And there's often a system in place to deal with leachate and things like that. So it's easier for that array to be there on a long-term basis. The more nuanced situations are often when you go to a former coal-fired power plant, or you go to a refinery, or you go to a chemical plant that has a significant land area because they established a buffer zone over time, or they used some portion of that property for schmooze that have since been closed. But those are great opportunities to place solar development there, but they don't necessarily have this uniform cap over the area of property on which you can place the array. So you have to get into much more of a dialogue about where is the cap going to be placed, or where can we put the array, and what happens to our long-term monitoring and natural attenuation obligations for the contamination while we've placed the solar array there. So that's I think where this gets much more interesting from a solar development standpoint on a brownfield.
Jason, I'm so glad you brought that up, and I was going to bring this up later in the podcast, but I can't help myself now. We are seeing the brownfields that we love and look at the most are those where there was like an ex-chemical plant, or a steel manufacturer, or anything like that. And what we see is these giant cement bases that where the building used to be, the rest of the building was grazed, and just this giant cement base, and an owner of the project that says, gosh, I would love to do something with this, but I don't know what to do. I've brought in a bunch of other developers. They can't figure out what they want to do with it. And they don't even realize solar is an option, because they think that we have to pound poles into the ground and dig ditches and everything else. But those are our favorite sites. We treat them just like a landfill. We'll go in, we just put like a cement ballasted block on the bottom, put, the panels on top of that. It's almost like putting solar on a rooftop. And then what that does is those panels have like a 35-year lifespan. It's able to allow that soil to sit there and do its thing for the required period of time. And the owner is then able to charge rent for us being able to sit on it. And almost always those locations, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, have the appropriate electrical infrastructure on site that we can tie into. And so it's just a huge win that I think a lot of these people don't appreciate. And we see it firsthand. My daughter now is going to school in Ohio for college. And, first thing I did was look for sites out there. And, you find that, there's full of old manufacturing facilities out there, and they're all over the place. And we call these people up, and almost immediately they're like, wait, I can actually do that? This is great. Come on out. Let's figure it out.
So I was curious about brownfields, and was reading a little bit of sort of some survey literature. And in 2011, the Government Accountability Office estimated that there were about 650,000 sites that could be classified as a brownfield. So there are, to your point, just so many different types of former facilities, former sites that were used for some kind of industrial process that would qualify. So, it sounds like you're not going to be running out of them anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's you're right. And one of the bigger issues that we see in solar development in totality is there is this whole kind of NIMBY, not in my backyard. We almost everybody, regardless of political affiliation, say, hey, solar is a good thing. We're ready to head down this path. We just don't want it in our backyard. We want to find the right place, right? And that is one of the best things about brownfields and landfills is nobody ever has a complaint. If you can find a brownfield or a landfill, they're like, yes, that's a perfect spot for solar, right? And so we never get any resistance on that front. And you're right. And so if you look, the research I did, I think there's a lot of different information. We came up with about 450,000 brownfields representing 15 million acres of solar, which is astronomical. And there's 10,000 retired landfills out there. There's 3,000 plus active landfills that are going to retire at some point. And it's a huge opportunity, and figuring out how do we get people comfortable that, the mitigation factors are manageable is really a good question.
So, Mike, in my notes for the podcast, I wanted to ask you, why brownfields, but I think your passion has come across pretty clearly, and it's been really interesting to learn about why these are such great opportunities. But is there anything else you'd love to add on why, in particular, you think brownfields are such a great opportunity, especially for renewable developments?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there are a variety of things. So, as I mentioned earlier, first of all, we never hear a complaint. There's not my backyard when it comes to brownfields, landfills, but people would love to put solar on there. That's number one. Number two, the reason we love it is because they almost always have appropriate electrical infrastructure, which is one of the biggest gatekeeping factors we have. When we have the energy, we need a place to put it. And you need at least, 3-phase wires of a certain caliber to accept that electric. And most brownfields have that. We see a lot of landfills that are in close proximity to cities where there's actual demand there. And as a part of those projects, oftentimes we'll put in a dog park or other types of things where now it becomes a renewable energy education center and community area, where previously it was the landfill eyesore. And so, I think communities really embrace it from that standpoint. And then I think one of the third bigger items too is that this is a real situation where the landfill, when we put solar on it, we have to maintain that ground. We have to cut that grass. We have to, put a gate around it. We have to be out there a certain amount of times. And that is a fundamental cost for these landowners just to do that. And so not only do we reduce their costs, but we're also paying them lease payments and rent that help offset any monitoring obligations. And then it gives that location a purpose for the duration of its resting period, at which point then it could be, when you're ready to retire the solar, which perhaps we can talk about that a little bit. But when we're ready to retire solar, that land now can be developed for future manufacturing or, parks or whatever it may be. So those typically are kind of the three big things that we see.
I think there may be another one from the landlord's perspective too, Daniel, and that is that if you are at a facility that has managed hazardous waste over time under RCRA, right, that's the cradle to grave statute for hazardous waste management. But once your facility ends its life, you move from the RCRA regime to the CERCLA regime. And from a landlord's perspective, if there continues to be a generation of electricity at the site, I think there's a strong argument that you can remain under the RCRA regime and not trigger the closure and post-closure, not all of the closure and post-closure responsibilities that you might otherwise trigger. So you can delay the costs associated with those responsibilities out in time. And that's a real benefit that can be provided simply by placing the solar at the property.
Yeah, Jason, I can't overemphasize the point that you just made right there. We are actually talking with a lot of refineries and chemical companies today that they may have a little brownfield site on space, or they're looking at a potential brownfield instance in the future on existing operations. And they want us to put solar on that facility today, not only to offset their existing energy needs that are right there, but also do it in a contractual way. So if they ever need to shut down that facility, their primary, refinery or chemical manufacturing facility, that we can sell the electric back to the grid so that on site we have an operating asset that is active. And like you said, it triggers certain items, and doing that potentially shifts what their cleanup obligations might be, where they can then close things down for a couple of years, but restart it later. And so anyway, we're seeing a lot of interest in that regard.
I think there's also, I was thinking as Mike was talking, that from given the emphasis on environmental justice that's happening right now, and given that many of these brownfields are located in communities, in environmental justice communities, and as Mike's pointing out, like, listen, if someone doesn't put something in that property and maintain it, it becomes a blight on the community. Like, how much better it is to redevelop the property as a dog park, have a solar facility there, have somebody putting up a nice fence, mowing the grass. This is to a benefit to the community, not just visually, but then also that it's supplying power to a densely populated area that needs the power.
And that's consistent with this administration's Justice 40 initiative, right? That communities that have been affected by industrial development and operations would see a significant alleviation, significant benefits from the energy transition, and that's sort of right in line with that.
Yeah, I mean, I firsthand experience right here. We are developing 3 community solar sites in South Chicago right now, right by the Ford manufacturing facility and a bunch of other manufacturing facilities. Those facilities are being dedicated to low-income subscribers. They're on or next to brownfields. And when we approached the community and we were like, hey, we want to put some solar here, talk about getting permitting, everything else, they're like, all right, what kind of chemicals and other things does this thing have that's going to inject in our fuels? We're like, no, it has nothing. This is actually going to be good. It's going to give that ground an opportunity to settle and refine itself. And you may find 35, 40 years that this is a developable site for nice, stores or homes or whatever. And they could not have been more excited about solar coming into that community at that point.
You and Daniel better compare notes offline, because he just spent the last 2 years of his life helping the city of Chicago to build the Obama Presidential Library on the south side of Chicago. So they may be very close to one another.
That's amazing. Yeah. No, it's amazing that the farm and city mixture right there and industry, it's all 3 of them so closely coexist. It's really an interesting part of the world for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike and Jason, it strikes me that as significant as these opportunities are, there are legal risks, and we've sort of touched on them a little bit. But what steps can CPG take? What steps can other developers take to sort of minimize the likelihood that they could be responsible for cleaning up or remediating a release or addressing any other kinds of site liabilities at these places?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and we get it all the time as far as what are the liabilities? How can we mitigate those? And so one of the interesting things that we always hear is, okay, what happens when your company goes bankrupt? We hear that these various solar companies have gone bankrupt over time. And so the answer to that question first, right out of the gate, is pretty simple. Solar companies go bankrupt. Solar projects do not go bankrupt. So as long as the sun is shining, the solar panels are creating energy, and that solar project is financially viable. So when the company goes into bankruptcy, the bankruptcy court, the first thing they do is make sure all the lease and rent payments are made so that there's no default on that lease, because that is going to be the most valuable asset in the sale of the bankruptcy, right? So then what we have to think about is, well, then how do we as a landowner protect ourselves to make sure that solar facility stays operating for its 35-year expected life? And one of the most important things that people don't think about inside their contract is making sure that the solar company has adequate insurance in place, right? So the biggest risk to solar farms is a hailstorm or a tornado or some type of water issue, depending on what your proximity to any type of water features are. And so having insurance that covers hail and tornado risk is critical. So in your contracting considerations. The other thing a lot of people talk about is decommissioning. Well, what happens at the end of the life of the facility? What do you do? And so this really started, I think, back in the early 2000s, late 90s. A bunch of wind farms were made. There was no decommissioning consideration. And now you have some wind farm graveyards that people had to deal with out in California. And so in the solar industry, that's not happening anymore. Across the country, everybody's gotten pretty sophisticated. When you get a permit, you need to have some kind of decommissioning bond in place. And there's a lot of kind of national standards now that dictate how that decommissioning bond is calculated. It escalates over time. And just ensuring that you have a financial bond or other type of security in place that can be tapped into by yourself in the event that the company, something happens, they didn't have adequate insurance or whatever it may be, and having that inside your contracts, is also really important. So I may have gone on a little bit of a tangent, Daniel. Did I answer your question? And Jason,
No, that's
do you have
great.
something that you'd like to chime in on?
Well, that tees up a little bit of a discussion about decommissioning, but I know that Jason, you spent some time thinking about and obtaining what's called a comfort letter from EPA. And could you tell us more about that process and why companies might want to look at those if they are looking at developing on a brownfield?
Sure. So under the CERCLA statute that I mentioned before, there is a defense called the all appropriate inquiry defense. And it basically suggests that if a new owner or operator comes onto a site that has contamination, if the new owner operator takes all appropriate inquiry, they can invoke that as a defense to being in the net of liability of the responsible parties. And one of the ways that you can sort of confirm that you have taken that all appropriate inquiry, and provided that during your activities you don't cause or exacerbate the conditions at the site, you won't fall into the net. But you can go to, at the federal level, EPA, and even in many of the states, we did one in Virginia recently, where you can get the agency to write you back with a, quote, comfort letter that basically offers you the assurance that, in fact, you've done all the things that you should have done. And so long as you do not cause or exacerbate conditions at the site, you won't be one of the potentially responsible parties.
And Jason, are there any other steps you would recommend from the legal side to minimize those sorts of risks of getting swept into the net?
Well, so all we've talked about so far is the statutory sort of liability regime, but you also can contractually allocate those statutory responsibilities between yourself and your counterparties. So if you're a landlord, you want to think about what are your residual responsibilities at the site, right? How am I going to deal with any pre-existing contamination? How do I assure myself that the solar array doesn't affect my ability to deal with that at the end of the life? Who's going to have control over the property during the period that the solar array is there? Who is going to be responsible if the neighbors do something to the property during the use period? Who's really in a position to control that? How do I take advantage of those additional end of life obligations that might be postponed by the existence of the solar facility? From the solar company's perspective, they only want to be, from a contractual standpoint, only want to be responsible for the impacts from their use of the property during construction and operation and decommissioning of the solar array, right? And they want to have some reasonable set of responsibilities for the upkeep of the property, appropriate access to the property, all those sorts of things. And if there's, like, let's say there's an ongoing set of groundwater monitoring wells that are scattered somewhere around the solar facility, like, you guys have to coexist during that period. And so you're going to have to come up with some contractual provisions for how to deal with access and things like that. But those are things that contractually we want to think about and allocate, and then always know that there's the statutory liability regime sort of hanging over that.
Yeah, Jason, I think those are really interesting and great points. And it's something that we talk in all these instances. We reach out to a city, we talk to the person who's administering the assets, and they say, we love it. It's a great idea. We really want to do this. And then they're like, I got to warn you. Now you're going to have to talk to our attorney. And oh my God, he's going to have so many demands. It's going to be unbelievable, but just stomach through it. We can get through it. And then, so we have the conversation, And we find that, hey, the questions they're asking, they're all reasonable questions. Generally speaking, they're all things that we've dealt with already. And usually they're really surprised. They're like, wait, you're okay with this? You're okay with us being able to get in? And, because a lot of it may be they have to monitor their methane pipes, or they need to have access if a methane has a leak and they can get in there. And we're like, yeah, sure. We'll be able to accommodate that, or we'll be able to design around it. And I think they overwhelmingly have been surprised with how well we've been able to accommodate the legal demands of the landowners of these facilities. So
I think one of the sort of coolest things that's happened during my period of practicing law is the ability to use a site for multiple purposes, to have co-located businesses at a site, and to contract around those responsibilities, because then you're getting more out of the land use, right? You're dealing with the residual responsibilities, you're building solar. Maybe you have if it's at a landfill, now you have RNG associated with the landfill, but the solar can also coexist with that. And the person who's good at solar can be there to do what they're good at, and the person who's good at RNG can be there to do what they're good at, and the person who's good at closure of a landfill can be there to do what they're good at. But they're not all one company. They're different companies, but they're figuring out how to contract to coexist at those sites. And the agencies are figuring out how to issue permits and authorizations to allow them to coexist. And I think that's really important. It's a great land use lesson, right? Because we're using a piece of land in an urban community for multiple purposes that maximize the value of that land being there.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, Jason, if the listeners could view me right now, they'd see my head going up and down in agreement with you, because that's definitely what we're seeing on the developer side too.
We have not gone to video podcasting yet. If we ever reach sort of Joe Rogan levels of popularity, that might change. But I definitely think it's been all smiles. This has been such a fun conversation. Before we close out, Mike, I want to give you sort of the final word. Do you have any concluding thoughts for us in this conversation? And any insights on sort of where your world is headed? It seems like there are tons of opportunities. Is there sort of a rush to develop these brownfields along these lines? What are we looking at for the next few years?
Yeah, I tell you, thanks for the question. I mean, it is, I think the brightest and greenest opportunities are in the brownest of fields these days. And so with the convergence of, people wanting solar, but wanting it in the right places, just lends itself right to brownfields. And I think more and more the owners of these brownfields are realizing that, hey, like Jason said, there's an alternative revenue stream here. And I just wish somehow that, and we're seeing it more and more, that there could be some kind of requirements that say, hey, when you're moving to post-closure permit, or when you're doing your annual monitoring, a part of that should be, is this site viable for solar? And we're seeing it now where companies are coming to us and that we do one thing with them and they're like, look at our entire portfolio. Here it is. Tell us where it's viable. And they're surprised at how fast we can go through their portfolio of assets and come back to them in a very detailed way and say, this site, these 15 sites aren't viable because of X, Y, and Z. This is the X, Y, and Z. It may change over time, but now you're armed with that. But these two little sites over here, they're perfect for it. And they're going to be a great opportunity for you. And I think just them having that level of clarity and understanding is huge, especially as we get into this world of potential reporting requirements as far as what people are doing, for green energy and to reduce their carbon footprint. This is like the easiest low-hanging fruit for making it profitable to make that transition. And so, I know our company welcomes any phone calls that say, hey, review our portfolio. I'm sure there are others out there that do that as well. But that would be my leaving thought.
Yeah, another way of making that point is that there's something in the energy transition for everybody, regardless of what kind of industry you're in, what kind of sector you're in, and paying attention to these kinds of projects is such an opportunity, even for more sort of traditional forms of waste management or energy generation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very well said. Very, very great way to say that for sure.
Jason, any concluding thoughts for you?
No, thank you for having us on. I think this is a great subject for the podcast. And, I look forward to seeing how these two things continue to kind of converge, because you're turning a problem into a solution for communities that have brownfields. And I think we've figured out the liability scheme at the statutory level and kind of built in the protections now. And the industries are figuring out more and more how to take advantage of that. And the developers are finding the right contacts within the industry to get it done. I think we're going to see more and more of this, and it's a net positive for the country and for for our climate change challenge. So I look forward to seeing how it evolves. And thank you, Mike, for coming on to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, the listener, for spending some time with us here today. This was a fascinating conversation for me. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And we will talk to you soon.